Hello, everyone. Welcome to Introduction to Buddhism Searching for an End to Suffering, a presentation for Pitkin County Senior Services. My name is Thomas DeZosh, and I will be your lecturer for this discussion. To begin our discussion of Buddhism, let's start at the beginning. Who was the Buddha? Legend tells us that the Buddha was born to a royal family in what is today Nepal. His mother had a dream in which she saw a white elephant who came into her room and entered her side. When she woke up, she knew that she was pregnant. She went to the king and told him of her dream, and the king was overjoyed. And they became very excited that they would be having a royal offspring. Her pregnancy was quite long, 10 months, and when it became time for her to give birth, as was the custom in that day and age, she was to return to her family's home. So she left the palace and began her journey to her family home. Along the way, it became clear that she would have to give birth on the road. So they pulled the caravan, as it were, into a large grove of trees. And as the queen approached a particular tree where she was planning to give birth, the branches of the tree reached down towards the queen. It was very common in those days that women gave birth standing up, grabbing a hold of a branch or something like that, and that was how the queen gave birth to her baby boy. However, the child did not come into the world in the normal fashion. Instead, he emerged from her right side, just where the elephant had entered her side in the dream. And when the boy was born, he was fully formed, it is said. He was able to walk and talk. He was able to stand and was, more like a toddler than a newborn. And it's said in the Buddhist texts that he took a number of steps in each of the four cardinal directions, and that he stood between heaven and earth, pointing one hand up to the sky and one hand down to the ground, and said, "Between heaven and earth, I alone will bring a stop to all the suffering in this world." His story from there goes on relatively normally for a prince. He was raised in great happiness. Um, he didn't want for anything. Shortly after his birth, a great sage came and looked at the child. He came to give the child a blessing. And when he looked at the little boy, he told the king and queen, "This child will either become a great king who will unite all the kingdoms of the world under one crown, or he will become a great spiritual teacher who will forever change the world." Well, I'm sure you can imagine his father, the king, preferred the first choice. He wanted his son to be a world monarch, what in Buddhism is called a chakravartin, a wheel turning king. And so, to this end, he set out to make sure that the prince never wanted for anything. The prince was given his own sort of palace near the main palace, and within the walls of the prince's palace, nothing negative was allowed. If people were sick, they were not allowed near the palace. Elderly people were not allowed near the palace. He knew nothing of old age, he knew nothing of sickness, and he knew nothing of death. He was surrounded at all times by young and beautiful people, by musicians playing beautiful music. He was given the best foods, the best clothing. He was, from all accounts, a brilliant student and was gifted in the martial arts. He was kind of the classic boy next door um, prince. That was until one day he decided that he wanted to leave the palace. So he told his best friend, who was also his attendant and charioteer, that he wanted to go out into the city surrounding the palace. Of course, this had to be cleared with the king and all of that, and the king made a decree throughout the kingdom that the streets should be cleared and cleaned, people should hang banners, and anyone who was sick or infirm or old should be kept at home. The prince cannot see anything negative while he is out on his uh, joyride around the town. And so the day came, and the prince and his charioteer, whose name was Chunda, left from the palace and went out for a ride in the prince's chariot. And as they were riding out, everything was just as the king insisted. It was like a parade, a festival out in the streets of the city. But there, just on the edge of the crowd, peeking around the corner from an alleyway, the prince saw an elderly person, an old woman bent over with her cane, peering around the corner, hoping to catch sight of the prince. And the prince looked at his charioteer and he said, "Chunda, what is that?" And Chunda said, "That is an old woman, my lord. Everyone becomes old eventually. This will happen to all of us. It will happen to your father, the king. It will happen to me. It will happen to you." And the prince leapt down from his chariot and pushed his way through the crowd. But by then the old woman had disappeared down the alley. And so the prince followed the alley. And he came to a building eventually where he could hear people wailing. And he looked through the window, and there inside the room was someone lying in the bed, sick, very, very sick, and the people around that person weeping out of concern for this person. And the prince looked at his friend and he said, "Chunda, what is that?" And Chunda said, "That person is very sick, my lord. This happens to everyone. All of us are subject to sickness. It will happen to your father. It has happened to me. It will eventually happen to you." And the prince was shocked. Twice today he had seen two things that he had never seen in his life. And he began to wander further, deeper into the back streets of the city, until he came to the banks of a great river where he saw a cremation in process. And he saw bodies wrapped in linen sheets, preparing to be cremated. And he said to his friend, "What is this?" And Chunda said, "This is death, my lord. This awaits all of us. Everyone eventually dies. Your father, the king, will die. I will die. And you will die." And the prince is shocked. He's never thought of these things. He's never imagined any of this. And in a daze, he wanders back through the streets, back towards the palace. And along the way, he runs into a mendicant, an ascetic, a monk. And he looks at his friend and he says, "Chunda, what is this?" And his charioteer friend says to him, "This, my lord, is a renunciate. He has given up the world and is seeking liberation." The prince returns to the palace and confronts his father. He says, "You have hidden all of these things from me. Why?" And his father tells him about the prophecy when he was born. And his father tells him that it is his duty and his destiny to become a great king, so he need not concern himself with the suffering of the world around him. But the prince cannot rest. He goes back to his palace, and he is overwhelmed with these things that he has seen. These are called the four passing sights: sickness, old age, death, and a holy person. And these things haunt the prince, even though everything around him is joy and laughter and beauty. In fact, his life is so filled with joy because his wife, whose name is Yashodhara, is about to give birth to their first child. And the story continues that night, the princess Yashodhara gives birth, while the prince is trapped in his own musings and thoughts about what he has seen out in the world. And late that night, the prince goes into his bedchamber, where he sees his wife holding their newborn son. And he looks upon his wife, and instead of seeing her beauty, he sees that she too will one day become old and sick, and that she will die. He looks upon his newborn son, and he sees that this child will bind him to this world, that the child represents responsibilities and suffering and attachment. And so he names the child Rahula, which means fetter, or that which binds us. And in the middle of the night, he leaves home. He runs away. And he takes his friend Chanda with him. They leave the palace and go to the edge of the great forest, where the prince cuts off all of his hair and tells Chanda, "Give me your clothes." And he and Chanda switch clothes, and he gives his cut off hair to Chanda and says, "You must return to the palace and tell them that I have left." And so the prince goes into the wilderness, not for selfish reasons as it might seem, but because he cannot reconcile the life that he has lived, a life of pleasure, a life into which his new child has been born, with the realities of old age, sickness, and death. And as he shaves his head and goes into the wilderness, he makes a promise that he will find an answer to these realities of sickness, old age, and death, and that he will find a way to conquer them, not just for his own sake, but for the sake of all people. And so the prince goes into the wilderness. First, he goes and studies with a couple of different very wise teachers who teach him the basics of meditation. And both of them teach him great things, and he's very skilled at meditation. But he finds in both cases that when he gets up from his meditation, though he has been in a state of bliss or peacefulness, he is still subject to old age, sickness, and death. And so each time, after staying with these teachers for many months, he decides to leave and find a new teacher. Eventually, he wanders deep into the wilderness and encounters 5 ascetics, and these guys are really hardcore. They rarely eat, they hardly drink, they don't have any clothing. They really just wear kind of a loincloth or maybe even go completely without clothing. They have no shelter. They sleep outdoors. And the prince takes up with these 5 ascetics for a time. And he's becoming more and more emaciated, closer and closer to death in his pursuit of liberation. And one day he's sitting under a tree near the bank of a great river. And as the story goes, he hears a music teacher going by down the river on a boat with his student, and they're learning to play a stringed instrument. And the music teacher says to his student, if you pull the string too tight, it will snap. And if you leave the string too loose, it won't produce any sound. And the prince has an aha moment. And he realizes that these two extremes are exactly what he has experienced in his own life. The life of living in luxury in the palace is playing the string too loose. But this new life, of the life of an ascetic, where he's starving himself so terribly, is playing the string too tight. There is no liberation to be found in either. And he thinks to himself that he will develop a new path, what he calls the middle way. And so he wanders down to the river and bathes himself. And as he's coming out of the river, he sees a young girl, a milkmaid, it is said in the texts. And she sees this man who is emaciated and big bushy beard, and she realizes that he's hungry, so she offers him rice milk, and he eats. And the five ascetics with whom he's been living see him eating and talking to a girl, and they think to themselves, oh, he has lost the way, and they leave. They abandon him. And the prince is fine with this. He sits back down under his tree now that he's bathed and gotten himself some clothing to give himself some protection from the elements. And he's eaten. He's taken care of his body. And he sits back down under the tree and vows to himself that he will not get up until he has truly understood how to end sickness, old age, and death. And during that one night, sitting under the tree, he is confronted by Mara. Mara is sort of the embodiment of our ego, the tempter, who challenges the prince and asks him, who do you think you are? Many people have tried to find liberation, and all have failed. You're just like everyone else. And the prince says to Mara, no, the earth bears witness to my vow, and I will find a way to escape sickness, old age, and death. And in that one night, as the morning star rose, the prince saw into the nature of reality. He had his profound realization, his awakening, and he ceased to be the prince and became the Buddha, which means the awakened one. I mentioned his great realization. So, what was it that the prince, now the Buddha, realized in that evening's meditation that took him across that finish line, that helped him to gain true liberation? In the simplest sense, we could say that he gained insight into what are called the three marks of existence. The three marks of existence are anicca, impermanence, anatta, non-self, and dukkha, suffering. So let's look at each of the three. Impermanence. He saw that nothing in the world lasts forever. He saw that all things eventually deteriorate. And more importantly, he saw that all things are in a constant state of change. That led to anatta, non-self or not self. It is often said when you read about Buddhism that Buddhism rejects the idea of the self and it rejects the idea of a soul. And this is, in a way, true. Buddhism does reject the idea that there is anything permanent about us. It says that we do not have some permanent, unchanging, essential peace that underlies who and what we are. Instead, the Buddha found that all human beings are subject to constant change. The body is changing, the mind is changing, the emotions are changing, our thoughts are changing. If we think about who we are today and we ask ourselves what resemblance that person has to who we were when we were in high school, we might find that the answer is not very much. The Buddha would say that that makes perfect sense because what we think of as a self isn't a permanent and unchanging reality. There is some sense of continuity, some sense of consciousness or awareness, but it's constantly changing. It's not a permanent, unchanging reality. And the third thing that he realized is that all things are marked by dukkha. And dukkha was the first teaching that the Buddha gave after his enlightenment. When he had his realization under that tree, the first thing he thought was, no one will understand what I'm talking about. There's nothing I can say that people will get. But the longer he sat, the more convinced he became that he had to share his realization with others. And so he thought to himself, who better to tell than those 5 ascetics with whom I have been sharing my days for so long? So he went back into the wilderness and found the 5 ascetics. And though they had rejected him when he bathed and ate and sat down to talk with a woman, they could tell that something now was quite different about this young man. He was only about 30 years old. And so they decided to listen to what he had to say. And he gave his first teaching, which is referred to as the Dharma Chakra Pravartana Sutra, the turning of the wheel of the Dharma. In this case, Dharma means truth or law. And in this first teaching, which is quite brief, the Buddha told these 5 ascetics that there were 4 noble truths that he had realized about reality. The first noble truth is that all life is marked by dukkha. Now, already I've translated dukkha as suffering, but more accurately, we might translate it as discontent or discomfort. Literally, dukkha means bad axle hole. If you build a wheel, you have to put the hole for the axle in the dead center. Otherwise, the cart or the car will wobble no matter where you go. And the Buddha said that this is the state of all living creatures. They go through life with a wheel with an off-center axle hole, so that everywhere we go, our ride is just a little bumpy, just a little uneven. We look around at the world and we always want things to be somewhat different than they actually are. We are never content. We are never happy. We always want more. We always want something other than what is right in front of us. Even when we are dealing with something that makes us happy in the moment, that happiness is fleeting. It is impermanent. The second noble truth was that there is a cause to this dukkha. And the Buddha said that that cause was called tanha. Sometimes it's translated as trishna, thirst or craving. What is it that we crave? We crave for things to be other than they actually are. We crave things to be perfect. We crave for things not to be impermanent. A great example might be eating gelato. I think about eating gelato, and I've had these experiences where I'm eating my favorite flavor of gelato, which is green tea gelato. And I'm about three-quarters of the way through my bowl of gelato, and I'm really enjoying it. But just suddenly, the idea creeps up into my mind, oh, I've eaten three-quarters of what's in this bowl. It's almost gone. And when I eat the rest of this, the gelato will be gone. There, in the midst of what is seemingly happiness, I'm already discontent. I'm already engaging with dukkha because I desire for the gelato to be permanent. I desire for it to go on forever. This is a very simple example, but it begins to get at what the Buddha was talking about when he taught about dukkha and craving. The third noble truth was that the Buddha had found that there was, in fact, a way to escape from dukkha. In order to escape dukkha, one has to end craving. And finally, the fourth noble truth, the way to end craving and thus escape from dukkha is to follow the eightfold path, the path of right living, which the early Buddhist community committed to. This is an ethical teaching that the Buddha gave that laid out a way of life for those who wished to escape from suffering. Things included in the Eightfold Path are things like right speech, right intention, right livelihood, and right mindfulness. In this case, when we use the word right, we don't mean right in opposition to wrong. We really mean right in the sense of realistic. We could use speech as a great example. If what we want is to escape from suffering and to escape from craving and desire, what kind of speech is likely to help us get there, and what kind of speech is likely to hold us back? That's how right speech is understood in the early Buddhist teachings. Another part of being a member of the early Buddhist community was taking refuge in what were called the three jewels, and you'll often hear these referenced if you hear a conversation about Buddhism. The term used is taking refuge, meaning to put one's faith and reliance in these three things. When a person does these three things, they are considered to be a Buddhist. The first thing a person takes refuge in is the Buddha himself. Now, understand that this does not mean that they take refuge in the Buddha as being a god or a divine being. The Buddha is understood to be a human being who did extraordinary things. So when people take refuge in the Buddha, they're taking refuge or stating their faith in the fact that the Buddha's realization is something of which we are all capable. We are saying, if we become Buddhists, if we take refuge in the Buddha, then one is saying that they acknowledge their own potential for Buddhahood. The second refuge is refuge that is taken in the Dharma. The Dharma are the Buddha's teachings. So, in taking refuge in the Dharma, a Buddhist acknowledges that they have confidence in what the Buddha taught, that they believe and find through experience that the Buddha's teachings do, in fact, lead to freedom from dukkha. And third, a Buddhist takes refuge in the Sangha, the community of other Buddhists. There is a notion within Buddhism that one is responsible for one's community, one is responsible to one's community. The early Buddhist community consisted of monks, nuns, laymen, and lay women. All four of those groups would have taken particular vows. Monks took about 250 vows, nuns took about 350 vows, laymen and laywomen each took about 10 vows. um, in the early period of Buddhism, it was understood that monks and nuns had the best chance of achieving enlightenment or entering what is called nirvana. As Buddhism evolved and developed, it became more open-ended. It became understood that lay people also had a chance of achieving enlightenment, though it might take many, many lifetimes to do so. So there are three expressions that we might hear, or three iterations of Buddhism that we might hear talked about in the modern world. The first is called Theravada, and the Theravada, it means literally the way of the elders. This is the form of Buddhism that's practiced in Thailand, Burma, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Laos, that part, Southeast Asia primarily. And Theravada is really reliant on monastic communities first and foremost. It's the closest in some ways to how things were very early on in Buddhism. It's really focused on meditation and individual realization of enlightenment, and there's a strong emphasis on monastic life and ethical living. The goal is to become an arhat, which means a worthy one. Essentially, it means an enlightened person, but it does not mean that you're a Buddha. It means that you are a person who has achieved nirvana, which means that you will no longer be reincarnated. You cease, or you are snuffed out like a candle. That's actually what nirvana means, is to snuff out like a candle flame. So an arhat is a person who has stopped or snuffed out their reincarnation process. The second form of Buddhism that you'll hear talked about is the Mahayana. It means the great vehicle. And it's a great vehicle because it incorporated bringing in more people. It opened the door to lay practitioners more so than the early teachings did. The Mahayana teachings emerge roughly 500 years after the Buddha lived. The Buddha's dates are somewhere around somewhere around 5 or 600 BCE. So the Mahayana emerges somewhere around 100 BCE, and extends in its development up through the 5th or 6th century Common Era. As I said, it's called the Great Vehicle because it allows for more people to be carried along in this quest for liberation. Though there were teachings in the early schools that focused on compassion, compassion really becomes the central focus of the Mahayana. And that compassion is embodied in the ideal of the Bodhisattva, which means the enlightenment being. The Bodhisattva becomes the new goal rather than the Arhat. And the Bodhisattva makes a vow to give up their own enlightenment, to give up nirvana until all beings can be liberated from this suffering world. Just as we saw in Hinduism, if you've listened to the Hinduism lecture, Buddhism is still dealing with this reality of samsara, cyclic existence, where beings are reincarnated over and over again. And as the Buddha discovered, what characterizes that world of samsara, that world of reincarnation, is dukkha, this suffering of endless rebirth and craving. Finally, the third form of Buddhism that you might hear mentioned is called Vajrayana, the diamond vehicle. This is Tantric Buddhism or esoteric Buddhism. It's primarily practiced still today in Tibet and in Japan. There are still a few Vajrayana schools within China as well. This is the diamond vehicle. It's called the diamond vehicle because the practices of the Vajrayana are thought to be sudden, like a flash of lightning, and indestructible, like a diamond. Vajra can also mean thunderbolt or lightning bolt, so diamond or thunderbolt vehicle. In the Vajrayana schools, emphasis is placed on realizing that you already are an enlightened being, that you are essentially a Buddha. You just don't realize it yet. It is the potential of all living beings to become enlightened. And in some forms of Vajrayana, you'll even hear it said that it's not just the potential of all beings to become enlightened, it's actually the ultimate destiny of all beings to become fully enlightened beings. In the Vajrayana, there's a lot that is involved with ritual practice, most especially ritual practices where one imagines oneself to be a Buddha or to be an enlightened being. And in imagining oneself that way, the idea is that you sort of shift your attitude or your outlook so that you become more and more aligned with what you really are. Um, the Vajrayana also offers the possibility to its adherents that enlightenment could be possible in one lifetime alone, because it's believed that the Vajrayana teachings are so profound and so powerful that they could propel an individual to that kind of realization in just one lifetime. Finally, one of the things I wanted to talk about in this presentation was to look at some of the central teachings or really central practices that are associated with Buddhism. And so I just wanted to give you a list of some of the main things. Of course, when everybody thinks of Buddhism, they think of people sitting on a cushion meditating, right? So that's usually referred to as shamatha and vipassana, or calming and insight. In Japan, that shamatha and vipassana is sort of condensed to the term zazen, which is where we get the name of Zen Buddhism, because that's really their main practice, is doing zazen, or doing sort of a combination of shamatha and vipassana. Shamatha is learning how to focus the mind. If you've heard of the mindfulness meditation movement, that is shamatha meditation or calming meditation, where you learn to focus the mind on one particular thing, usually focused on the breath, and slowly discipline the mind, sort of exercising it like a muscle. Vipassana is insight, which is thought to naturally arise when the mind is calm and focused. So, what people say is that when they're sitting in shamatha for long periods of time, they'll just suddenly realize something very clearly. It could be something they were thinking about before or something that they've always wondered about, but they'll have these moments of clarity or insight which emerge out of their shamatha. That is called vipassana. Another teaching that we find, another practice that we find in the early part of the Buddhist teachings, is a practice called metta, or loving kindness. Metta practice is a practice where we think of another person and we generate feelings of love and concern for that person. And I'm actually going to share a little bit of metta with you at the very end of this presentation, just to give you a taste of what metta practice looks like. We also see the development of other compassion practices. There's a practice that's done in Tibetan Buddhism in particular called Tonglen, which means sending and receiving. And that practice is one that really allows the individual to develop a certain quality of empathy for another person, deep empathy, because the practice is that you imagine breathing in the illness or pain of another person, and you breathe out health and well-being. You could also breathe in their fear or their confusion. There are lots of ways that Tonglen practice is talked about, but the idea basically is that you take in heavy and negative, and that you transform it, because the idea in Buddhism is that those things are impermanent and insubstantial. So it's no problem to breathe them in because you can transform them. And you breathe out relief or lightness, kindness, those kinds of things. In the Vajrayana schools, we also see practices that involve ritual practice, visualization of Buddhas, visualization of bodhisattvas, visualization of deities, all of which is done in order to align our own self image with the image of an enlightened being of some sort. So it's sort of training the individual to think like and act like an enlightened being. So, sort of a mind over matter practice. Buddhism is full of many, many, many different kinds of practice. I'm just giving you a couple of different examples here. This is by no means even beginning to scrape the surface of all of the different ways in which Buddhism has developed practices to train the mind and to strive towards liberation from dukkha. Now, as promised, I will just give you a little taste of what the metta practice, the loving kindness practice, looks like in Buddhism. So I will invite you to just sit comfortably in whatever chair you're sitting in. And you can close your eyes and just take a couple of deep breaths, allowing your body to relax a little bit. Just letting your mind quiet down for a moment, feeling the sensation of the air moving in and out through your nostrils or your mouth. And now, continuing with your eyes closed, you could think of a person who you care about very much, and you could imagine them sitting in front of you. You can see them sitting there comfortably, smiling gently at you, maybe. And we're going to generate 4 wishes for this person. And you can just imagine that as you make this wish for the person, a soft white light emerges from your own heart and sort of shines out towards that person. The important thing in this practice is that you really feel the kindness of each of these wishes as you direct it towards that person. So, the first wish: may you be free from danger. May you be free from danger. May you be safe. May you be protected. May no harm come to you. The second wish: may you have mental happiness. May you have mental happiness. May you be free from stress and anxiety. May you be free from worry and fear. May you have peace of mind and joy. The third wish is may you have physical happiness. May you have physical happiness. May you be well. May you be healthy. May your body support you. May you have enough to eat. May you have a place to sleep. May you have physical happiness. And the fourth wish, may you be happy. May you be happy. May your life be free from painful obstacles. May your relationships and your livelihood and your family life bring you joy. May your life be full of good things. May you be happy. And now you can take just a moment to let go of the visualization and just return to the feeling of your own breath rising and falling in your chest. Thank you for dipping your toe into the water of loving kindness practice with me. Uh, my wish for all of you is that you be happy and that you be well. This has been an introduction to Buddhism for Pitkin County Senior Services. My name is TJ Dazash, and I look forward to being with you for another topic very soon. Thank you, everyone. Take care.